It is April 18, 1943, and a squadron of P-38 Lightnings is skimming low over the Pacific waves. Inside his cockpit, First Lieutenant Rex Barber battles the stifling heat, pushing on with grim determination. He knows they are hunting the most significant target of their careers, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor and who once boasted he would negotiate peace from the White House. The American squadron presses on until the shores of Bougainville Island appear on the horizon. Rex Barber scans the sky. The intelligence was precise: 1 Betty bomber and 3 Zero fighters. Exactly here, exactly now. Their plan is simple and calculated. 12 Lightnings will climb to a high altitude to provide top cover, while the remaining 4 P-38s, the designated kill group, will focus entirely on the bomber carrying their target. They are almost within sight of Bougainville when the radio crackles. Targets, 11 o'clock high. As if on cue, an enemy formation emerges from the clouds. 6 Zero fighters, and not 1 Betty bomber, but 2. The American pilots are stunned. Their meticulously planned operation is crumbling. Which one carries Yamamoto? We have to take down both. Roger that. The formation shoves throttles to the firewall, hurtling towards the impending battle. Around Barber, 12 of his squadron mates rapidly ascend, taking up their high cover positions, leaving the 4 chosen pilots to execute the daring attack. But further complications arise. First Lieutenant Besby Holmes's auxiliary fuel tanks refuse to jettison. Give me a moment, I'll force them off. Barber watches tensely as Holmes peels out of formation, gaining speed to shed the stubborn tanks. Ray, go with him. His wingman, Raymond Hine, swiftly follows to protect him, instantly halving the kill group. Their odds are worse than ever. 2 targets now, with half the fighters. Yamamoto is right in front of them. They will not give up, not even if it is the last thing they do. Yamamoto was en route to visit one of the 4 operational airfields around Bougainville, accompanied by 8 of his officers, including his loyal chief of staff, Matome Ugaki. Ugaki was reclined in his seat when a Zero escort suddenly streaked past, then slowed directly in front of their Betty bomber, rocking its wings. Puzzled, Ugaki peered out, realizing the pilot was waving frantically, pointing excitedly at something. Then, abruptly, the radio operator screamed for the pilot to dive, and the Betty executed a sudden, evasive maneuver. All the officers braced themselves as the Japanese bomber plunged into a desperate dive. Ugaki frantically scanned the sky for Yamamoto's aircraft, but without success. Outside, 3 Zeros broke off to defend the 2 bombers against the incoming P-38s, desperate to halt the attack. Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr., one of Barber's remaining wingmen, peeled away from the formation, climbing to engage the Japanese fighters head-on, leaving Barber to press his attack alone. Lanphier opened fire, and the Zeros responded in kind, tracer rounds crisscrossing the sky. Lanphier remained unyielding as small-caliber bullets hammered his wings, their impacts echoing through the fuselage like hailstones. He kept his finger on the trigger, unleashing his weapons until the Zeros were forced out of their collision course. Barber, meanwhile, pressed on, leaving the dogfight behind him. Ahead, the 2 Betty bombers diverged in opposite directions. He chose one at random and began his pursuit, but he was not alone. Suddenly, a stream of tracer fire flashed directly past his cockpit. One of the Zeros from Lanphier's engagement was now on his tail, firing from above. Tracers continued to streak past his windscreen. He fought the urge to break off, locking his sights firmly onto the bomber. Barber squeezed the trigger, unleashing a torrent of 12.7mm and 20mm cannon fire. Shells ripped into the enemy aircraft, engine cowling parts tore away, and a cloud of oil streamed from the damaged machine. But Barber was relentless. He kept his finger on the trigger, even as he heard and felt enemy rounds tear into his own aircraft from behind. He had to bring this bomber down, even if it was the last thing he ever did. Then, abruptly, his pursuing Zero overshot him, granting him vital moments of respite. Barber acquired an even better aim and continued to dismantle the bomber, tearing it to shreds as he chased it down to treetop level. Suddenly, the bomber pulled up uncontrollably, flipping in midair. Barber immediately banked hard, narrowly avoiding its wing as it plummeted out of control and slammed into a tree below, erupting into a colossal fireball. Barber looked back to see a pillar of black smoke rising from the jungle canopy. It's down. What's next? He sped towards the other bomber, but 3 more Zeros intercepted him from above. They opened fire, and Barber dodged, diving low to gain speed, listening to enemy rounds pummel his wings and tail, the impacts reverberating through the fuselage. Barber hugged the treetops, jinking left and right in a desperate fight for survival. The 3 enemies maintained their relentless assault, but just as things reached their most perilous, he spotted Holmes's and Hines' P-38s ahead. There was hope. He flew towards them, praying they would see him. Fortunately, his prayers were answered. The 2 Lightnings veered directly towards him, speeding to the rescue. But then, muzzle flashes gleamed from their noses. His heart seized. Time slowed to a crawl as friendly tracers streamed directly towards him. He held his aircraft steady, and the rounds whistled past. He was surrounded by bullets, rounds from both allies and enemies, tearing through the air around his machine. The Lightnings drew closer, their guns blazing, until they streaked past him. Suddenly, an eerie quiet descended upon the sky. Barber looked back, horrified. All the aircraft had vanished. The P-38s were rapidly pulling away, and the Zeros had been scattered by the daring charge of the 2 Lightnings. He took a deep breath and launched himself towards the last Betty bomber. Holmes and Hine returned, having saved Barber's tail. It had been a risky shot, but it worked. Now, they pursued the last remaining bomber. Holmes attacked it as it tried to escape, skimming the waves of the sea. Holmes opened fire, unleashing as much ammunition as possible into the massive target. But the aircraft stubbornly remained airborne, filling more and more of his windscreen. He pressed the attack for as long as he dared before peeling off low, sending his P-38 roaring through the gap between the enemy and the sea. Rex Barber watched his squadron mate barely avoid colliding with the heavily damaged Betty, but quickly realized the target was still flying. He swooped in without hesitation, positioned himself directly behind the bomber, and squeezed the trigger. His rounds struck a fuel tank, igniting the volatile fumes. The bomber erupted in flames and plunged into the sea. Barber had no time to react, flying directly through the explosion as flames enveloped his aircraft. Yet, he emerged on the other side, unscathed. There was no time to celebrate. Directly ahead, he found Holmes and Hine entangled with 2 Zeros. Hine's P-38, riddled with bullets, peeled away with critical damage, while one of the Zeros was shot down by Holmes. Barber plunged into the fray, surprising the last Zero and blasting it from the sky. Then, finally, the squadron leader's voice came over the radio. "Everyone, return to base." But as a jubilant squadron headed back to base, a figure emerged from the sea, surrounded by the burning wreckage of his aircraft. It was Matome Ugaki, severely wounded, but alive. The pilot, too, had miraculously survived, and together, the 2 men swam back to shore, clinging to a piece of debris. A 3rd survivor would also be recovered by a seaplane after the incident, making them the only crew members from both bombers to return home. Yamamoto had been in the first bomber. He was killed by Barber's gunfire even before the aircraft crashed. His body was recovered and buried. His loss deeply wounded the Japanese people. The entire nation mourned the revered admiral extensively. A full military funeral, with the highest honors, was held for him, attended by vast crowds. Few were as profoundly affected as Ugaki, who never forgave himself for surviving the attack. He would chronicle the events in his diary, recalling, "Tracers streamed past our wings, and the pilot desperately maneuvered to evade. I waited impatiently for the aircraft to return to level flight so I could observe the admiral's bomber. Though I hoped for the best, I knew all too well what the aircraft's fate would be." He described the nose of a P-38 seeming to explode with glittering flame, and suddenly the bomber shuddered from the impact of enemy machine gun rounds and cannon shells. Everything turned black. I felt the overwhelming force of the seawater as it poured into the fuselage, and we were almost immediately beneath the surface. Ugaki continued to serve in the Navy for the remainder of the war, until the Emperor announced the end of hostilities on August 15, 1945. Distraught, that very same day he donned his officer's uniform, took the ceremonial sword Yamamoto had gifted him, and carried it on the final kamikaze attack of the war. On the American side, Yamamoto's death was met with great jubilation, but it was not all celebration. Tragically, First Lieutenant Raymond Hine would never return home. His crippled P-38 gave out somewhere during his return journey. Every individual on the mission would be awarded the Navy Cross for their participation in the attack. Rex Barber survived the war and returned home, passing away on July 26, 2001.